So for those that are on, Christian Lavers is obviously here tonight with us to present and share some of his thoughts on a topic that I've heard bits and pieces of, but not the whole topic. The aim is going to be for Christian to kind of take over here in just a second, and then you should already have the access, Christian. I made you co-host, and then he'll start talking. And what we'll do is we'll make sure everybody's muted, and then at the end, if you have questions, you can send them to me in the text box, or you can send them to everyone in the text box. And then at the end, if there's time, we will obviously try to answer as many as possible. So just to give you guys a little intro about Christian. Christian is the president of the ECNL. He's also an attorney. He's a man of like 47 different trades, so I'll let him, if he wants to share any of those, he can. But he's been very insightful within U.S. Club Soccer and ultimately within kind of the direction in the last 8 to 10 years of where some of the youth side has gone. So Christian, thanks for coming. We appreciate it, man. I know you got young children and you're stuck in the house, I assume, like the rest of us, but thanks for making some time on a Monday night. So
no, I appreciate being here. Can you hear me all right?
All good.
I think you forgot some important pieces of the bio. One, I've had some good Spanish wine with Zecca and Tony in Valencia, but more important than that is that I met Mr. Bernard about, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago at ID2 camp when we were two young aspiring coaches, and I learned how late you could stay out at night and how loud you could snore at the same time.
Those two go hand in hand for sure.
So
I wasn't going to bring that up, but thanks, Christian.
It was impressive, both of them, for sure. So I guess I'll start with saying everything in this presentation is basically take it for what it's worth to you. Some of it, has some background in terms of a study here, a study there, but a lot of it is opinion. It's based on what I believe, what I've learned, what smarter people than me have shared with me. So hopefully some of it's relevant to you, and if it's not, take it and move on. But at any point, and I think I can probably, if I can't see questions, I'm sure Matt, maybe you can. But if there's questions that come up on anything, or if you want to go into a bigger topic at any point or dive deeper, just let me know, because it's a little awkward talking on a computer and not even to be able to see body language, because I can only see a few people at a time here. So now I'm trying to figure out there we go. All right, so we're going to talk through basically 3 different topics here that are interspersed. One is just starting from the position of the leader as a director of coaching and what that role is, how it relates to the club, and some thoughts maybe on how to look at that position. Number 2 is a little bit on the player and how players learn, and some methodology to think about in terms of how you structure things within the club. And then 3 is a brief segment on game models and some thoughts on how to put that together within a club environment. So I start out with these 2 quotes because I think they're really, really interesting. The first one, "Who only knows about football does not even know about it," is a Vitor Frada quote, who's considered the father of the tactical periodization theory. And I think that quote is specifically from some of the background of learning and cognitive science and how it applies to tactical periodization. But I think within this context, it also tells us that if all we know about soccer is X's and O's and how we're coaching a team, we're probably not going to be effective as a coach as much as we need to. And we're certainly not going to be effective as directors or as we move into more leadership roles within a club, because you have to know a lot more than just tactics and technique and that sort of stuff in soccer. The second quote here is Mark Twain. it ain't what you don't know that gets you in trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so. And I think this is a good reminder that we should always take what we're given and filter it through a critical lens and decide whether it makes sense in our perspective. And just because somebody who maybe works for a big club or has a big name or brand behind them doesn't mean that what they're talking about is actually true. And so I think we constantly also need to reassess why we're doing things and whether we're doing the right things as we learn more and more and more about the game, the learning process, and managing a club in these environments. So I think those quotes are a good backdrop. So a couple of questions also, and I like it. Typically, when I do this at this point is when I can look around the room and get some people to answer questions, and probably not going to be able to do that here. But I think about the first question of what is the typical American coaching career path? And I start that thinking my first coaching job, I don't know if anybody here wants to share their first coaching job or how they got it. And Matt, Matt, can you actually see comments or see people on this?
Yeah, I can see, and I can see comments. I just sent a message to everyone that if they have questions, to put it in the text box.
So yeah, why don't you jump in, because I don't think I can see that. So if somebody does, but my first coaching job came when I was working at Einstein's Bagels, slicing bagels at 6:30 in the morning for $6.25 an hour, and somebody said you can coach soccer for $1,000 for a season, and I did the math and figured that was a lot of hours of slicing bagels. And there was, I think a lot of us have started our coaching career in similar things where we're young, playing is kind of ended, and you just kind of fall into it. And I think it's a lot better environment now in terms of some of the onboarding of what happens with a young coach and how a young coach is mentored and given some tools for long-term success. But I don't think there is nearly enough in this country of looking at coaching as a profession and a career path where there is advancement, and where what you're doing when you're age 55 is different than what you're doing when you're age 25. And I think that's something that we need to look at in terms of the impact that has on the sport. And we'll talk through that a little bit later. And ultimately, the Peter principle is basically that you get within a corporate bureaucratic structure, you get promoted to the level of your incompetence, which means Zeka is the most incompetent person in your organization at this point because he's been promoted very highly up there. And what the analogy typically to that is that, in a sales organization, for a long time, people took the best salesmen and made them sales managers because they felt if they were great at sales, then they'll be great managing other salespeople. And there are completely different skill sets required there. And I think coaching and being a director of coaching is another very similar analogy to that. What it takes to be a great coach of players and teams is a different skill set than it takes to lead a soccer club and to be a director of coaching. And we have to ask if in this career path, are we preparing young coaches to be successful at the next step as they become directors of programs or directors of genders or directors of age groups and ultimately into whatever other director roles they have? Or are we just sort of pushing people up because they've been around for a long time? Second question is related to that, which is how many coaches and directors do you see in youth soccer that are over the age of 50? And generally, if you look around a room, you see a lot of people coaching who are in their late 20s and early 30s. You see still a pretty good number of late 30s, early 40s, and then there's a drastic drop-off as we get into the mid 40s, late 40s, and then certain 50. And you have people that have spent their entire life in one career in terms of coaching, and then they turn 55 and they're selling real estate and they're doing something totally outside of the realm of soccer. And I think that's fundamentally a failure of our profession. And if you look at it from a long-term perspective, when you have people that have 25, 30, 40 years of experience, they're the people that should be mentoring the next generation. They should be the people helping make sure that the new young coaches are in a far better position and are making fewer mistakes, or at least learning quicker than they are, because there's somebody to help them out along that process. And unfortunately, when those people are no longer in the game, or there's not a position in the game where they can be mentors and they can be leaders, we end up repeating a lot of the same mistakes from generation to generation. And young coaches make a lot of mistakes that maybe they shouldn't need to make if we had a better formalized career path. Third question now, when we look at moving into from the DOC and the leadership role more to the player, is a question of, why do you coach the way that you do? And if you really think through that, I mean, at some point in our career, we probably started coaching and we tried to think about, well, what do I remember doing as a player? And I'm going to imitate that. That might advance to some point, well, who did I like as a coach and what did they do and how did they act? And you try and do some of that. Or then ultimately you go to a course and somebody tells you this is the way you design a session, this is the way you run a team. But ultimately, I think you have to question, am I coaching in a way that helps the players learn? Or am I thinking more about how I coach or more about how players learn? And what does that mean about how I structure things within trainings? What does that mean as I look at how do I connect the training from the first week in September to the first week in October? Am I thinking about it from the player's perspective? And then finally, what makes your club, and I think you can switch your club with you as an individual, truly a professional organization or a professional soccer coach. And we all work for organizations in soccer. Everybody's good at sales. Everybody puts a slick website up and they do good social media and they do a lot of stuff that makes them function better as businesses. But is that what sets you as a professional in athlete development, or a professional in teaching youth players how to maximize potential, or a professional organization that helps players move along the pathway so that they can achieve the goals that they want? And, you know, we all talk about that, but can you say, this is why I am different than the guy down the street who we all look at and say, well, we're better than they are? What is it that you hang your hat on to do that? Or is there anything that you hang your hat on for that? So as you think of those questions in the background, then a couple of other comments I think that filter through this. And one is that excellence is idiosyncratic. And this just came out of a recent study. I think it was the Gallup organization that did this, and they looked at in the business realm, and they surveyed hundreds, maybe thousands of companies and leaders about what they do, how they do it, why they do it, and then they separated that from the companies that perform really well, or the leaders that perform really well, and the ones that don't, and then tried to come up with a list of, if we've taken all, you know, these thousands of people and said, okay, the ones that do really well do these things, and the ones that are crap don't do these things, then they come up with this profile. And I know some of you in the coaching education world, you see these coach profiles all the time, and this is what the profile of a coach is. And ultimately what the Gallup organization found is that when you take all these leaders together, I'm making this up, but just say there's 15 traits or 15 things that the great leaders do that the bad leaders don't. And that sounds really great. And then you start measuring everybody against those 15 traits. And what they found was that none of these leaders have all these 15 traits. They're really, really good in some of them, and they might be pretty bad in others, or not do them very well. But what made them excellent was the exceptional skill in a few critical areas unique to them, and then being able to surround themselves with other people that were really good in the areas that they weren't. So there was not a standard profile for what it took to be a great leader in business. And I think we need to look at that also in coaching, because we have this tendency, especially in sport, I think, to look at personalities, and people try and mimic, and they say, well, this is the Pep, this is the, you know, this is the whoever else you want to talk about, this is how you coach. And I think in youth soccer, especially in some educational environments, they try and give you this map saying this is the profile of the coach. And it doesn't feel right, I think, to a lot of us when you look through it all. And what they say is not always what you feel is maybe what works for you. And I think there's some truth in that that you need to think about. And this quote of content is king, context is God, I think is a very apropos way of saying that content is really important, but the context in which it applies is going to be very unique to you as a human and your personality and the environment that you're in. Second area is this concept of working in coaching or working on coaching. And so I took this idea from a Dave Ramsey, who's a business coach, and he talked about working in your business or on your business. And working in coaching is what you're doing when you're on the field with 18 kids in a team. You're working as a coach. Working on coaching is what you're doing when you're trying to be better at as a coach or help others be better as a coach. You're not working with players, you're not on the field, you're working on learning more about the craft or helping others learn more about the craft or become better as coaches themselves. And when you start getting into a director role, whatever that director role is, I think you have to start questioning how much time are you spending in each of these categories. And are you a director who's working with so many teams that you're really not able to give a lot of support or mentoring or feedback to coaches? Or are you able to do that? And some of that is going to be, to a degree, maybe outside your control based on some financial constraints or some structural constraints of the club. But if we are going to create career paths and keep people in the game long term and use the benefit of their experience, we need to have the ability to have older coaches who have titles of that they are directors to actually have the ability to direct coaches and not be coaching directly themselves. And that sort of ties into this next point, which is, are you in authority or are you an authority when you're coaching? We all are in authority by the fact that we have the title and we're generally very much older than the people that we're leading, but that doesn't mean that you're an authority in what you're talking about or you know what the heck you're talking about. And anything in leadership starts with the perspective that you better be an expert in what you're doing or you're ultimately not going to be as effective and helpful as you want. And so to me, the question here is, what are you doing so that you can say with confidence that you're an authority on what you're talking about and what you're teaching these kids and how you're teaching these kids, and not just somebody who's got the role. And then this final quote, I think, is great when we think about, again, going back to what is it that makes our organization professional? What is it that makes us stand out as being the best possible coach we can, and a more impactful coach than others around us, which is almost everyone does almost everything almost all the time to almost win. And I think when you think about that, it kind of puts, to me anyway, it makes me think about, what am I not doing, or what corners am I cutting, or where am I kind of pushing some things to a side because I'm too busy, because I want to do other stuff. What am I not doing that I really, really need to be doing to say that I'm a top level leader or a top level coach? I'll just pause here and let you read this quote. I kind of broke it up into a couple of bullet points because it's a long one. But I think this is where, if we're going to talk about leadership and if we're going to talk about what it takes to be a director, we have to start with what character you have and things like values and ethics. And I was a part of the study group that started to put together the new U.S. Soccer Director of Coaching license. And one of the things that I said in that group was that in none of the coaching courses is there anything substantive about ethics and values. And we take everybody just says, oh yeah, we're all ethical. And we know that's not the truth. And it's true in almost everything in education. I mean, as Matt said, I'm recovering now, but I was a lawyer for about 8 years. And of all the education you take, ethics was like the one class, out of 50 that you have. And continuing education, ethics is like the one credit out of 20 every year that you have to have, and everybody sort of rolls their eyes. But if we're going to be effective leaders, then it really is going to start with what we model as leaders, as directors, and as coaches, not only for our players, which we think about probably more often than we think about what our modeling is to our staff and to our peers and to our direct reports and even to the people that we report to. So taking that, this is a very, very crude graphic of what I think about when I think about a club. And, you know, on one, you have the staff and the infrastructure, which are really the building blocks that allow you to build your organization, and everything should be based upon the player. And again, we talk about that all the time, but I think it's constantly necessary to reinsert that everything should be about the player. But to me, this is how you think about building a club. And you start with values, beliefs, and behaviors. And when we think about youth soccer clubs, it's very rare that we actually think about this first. We think about style of play, we think about size, we think about all sorts of other stuff. But if you're going to build an effective club, you have to first start with, what is it we believe in? What is it that's important to us? What is it that we accept and reward? And what is it that we don't tolerate? And when we start talking about culture, we also talk a lot about aspirational things of these are the great things that we stand for here. Here's what we want to have. But I always like, and some of you may have heard this comment before, I always like to think that, and I stole this from somebody I don't even remember, but your culture is measured by the worst behavior that you tolerate. So when we're talking about all these things that we aspire to have or to be, and then we turn a blind eye to behavior that is really undermining that, because we're tired, because we don't want to confront it, because we just don't want to deal with it right now, that's really setting the basis of your culture. So when we talk about values, beliefs, and behaviors, we certainly have to say, why are we here? What do we stand for? What do we believe in? But very tightly tied to that is, what are we not here for? What is not acceptable here? From that point, I think you can build a game model, a philosophy, and a style of play, because those things tend to connect. Once you have a model and a philosophy, you have to put together your training and game methodology, which is how you're going to implement that model, how you're going to apply it over multiple levels and multiple age groups. It's helpful to think about that within phases. So, you know, I look at, and I think it's pretty similar in most places, but 10 and below is sort of a chunk, 11 through 14 is a chunk, 15 to 18 is a chunk, above that is a chunk. In those phases, what is important? What does a training environment look like? How do we do things and why do we do them? And then ultimately, on top of that, then you put in your coaching and teaching framework, which is when and how and why do we intervene? What is the type of conduct we expect from our coaches in terms of learning and teaching? So to me, this is the process of building a club, but it's fundamentally rooted, and it has to go back to values, beliefs, and behaviors. And that is rooted in the character and ethics and morals of the leader. So sort of similar to that, I'm sure we've all seen this type of graphic before. Again, the player at the center. And at first I used to think, why do I always see this? But I think it's a constant, it has to be a constant reminder. If you're not reminding yourself that the players are the center here, I think you can get distracted and you can get off course relatively quickly with all the things that go on. But these are the roles of us as coaches and as directors and leaders. One is to set, model, and reinforce values and philosophy. That includes not just the players and staff, but also the parents. We have to take responsibility for how the parents in our organization behave, both on the field on game day, but generally in terms of what's acceptable within the club in communications and behavior. We have to implement a game model, and we have to establish a methodology. And, you know, a methodology is much more, as I think most of the people on this webinar probably know, is much more than just a curriculum, which generally is a table of contents, right? That says, here's all the things that we need to talk about, but it doesn't tell you how you're going to teach them, when you're going to teach them, why you're going to teach them, when you're going to repeat them. But without all of these basic general categories of work, what you're trying to build as a club ultimately will not materialize that way. If you don't have a methodology consistent from age group to age group, you don't have a club. If your game systems and your training structure aren't similar from coach to coach, I don't think you have as effective as a club that you would like to have. So I'll go now deeper into all of these and sort of into some other areas. So first, when we talk about a club, you start, and you can also look at this, I think, from a personal statement of why you're coaching and what you want to accomplish as a coach in your career, and starting with a mission of why are you doing what you're doing? What is the purpose for you, either as a club or you as a coach? Why is it that you feel like you provide unique value? Or what is it that differentiates you from all of the other coaches or all of the other organizations that are out there? And a mission, and a lot of time when you hear mission statement or vision statement or anything like that, you see these sort of grandiose, long statements, again, really aspirational, and nobody can repeat what they are because somebody spent a lot of time on a retreat and you went to Napa, drank a lot of wine, and came back with a bunch of bullshit that goes on a website that nobody ever reads again, much less actually guides their decision making. And to me, if a mission is done right, it should be very, very succinct. It should be something that you can say within one sentence, within a handful of words, but then you can talk about it forever because it resonates deeply. So I use an example, not because it's perfect, and some of you hopefully know this, but the ECNL mission is 3 words, and it's raise the game. And to us, that encapsulates so many things that we can talk about making youth soccer better and what it takes to do that. But it needs to be very, very simple so that you can communicate it in your typical elevator pitch. And if you can do that, if you can break your mission down into something very, very simple, but then be able to expound on it and expand on it for a long time, you probably have something that everybody in your organization understands and is therefore far more likely to act consistently with. And when you've taken the time to do that properly, it gives you something that constantly will give you your North Star to guide tough decisions, to guide allocation of resources. And, you know, now in some ways is a perfect example of that. When we're sitting in this situation and the suspension of sport and we can't do anything that we're typically used to doing, some organizations are going to come out of this better and stronger because they know their mission going into it. They stick to their mission when they make tough decisions through this, and they're going to come out of it better, and others are not. Ultimately, as a DOC and as a coach, it's your job to embrace the mission of the organization. And so there's a difference, obviously, between, you know, your level of responsibility between how much you may play a role in developing it versus embracing it. But ultimately, if you don't agree with the mission of your organization, I think either the mission needs to change and you need to be a part of that process, or you probably just need to move on and go somewhere where you do agree with the mission. Because if you don't agree with it and you are not going to act consistently with it, then ultimately there's going to be a problem. So as a DOC, you hopefully have a bigger role in setting that, and the best missions are going to be somewhat collaboratively built. But you ultimately, whenever you're going into a new club or a new business, if you're not on board with the mission and the values, you're probably not going to last very long and be happy about it. And then ultimately, this is from a consulting company, McKinsey, aggressive reallocators of capital deliver higher returns. And to put that in a more simplified way, people that respond quickly in a changing environment and make good decisions quickly in a changing environment tend to do better. And I think youth soccer now, and probably over the coming months and years, has been a rapidly changing environment. I think youth soccer's changed more in the past 5 years than maybe the previous 20 in terms of the landscape and the leagues and what it means to be a top level club. And so you have to have a mission that defines your purpose with people that fully embrace it, but also know how to apply it in the context you're in and adapt what you're doing to accomplish your mission to an environment that can be kind of crazy from time to time. Another piece of career development is managing up. And so managing up is the concept of working with and communicating with the people you report to so that they are supportive of you, and also that so that you can help persuade them or lead them in the directions you feel are important. And in soccer, there's a lot of typically a lot of bitching about the board and what the board doesn't understand and what the board doesn't get, or the problems that are created by the doctors or the lawyers or the business people that don't understand the technical side. And ultimately, I think it's important to understand, and this is from a Harvard Business Review report several years ago, but this is across all industries. 16% of the board themselves felt they did not understand the industry of the companies of which they served on the board. 34% of these board members said they don't comprehend the company strategy. And of the executives in those companies, 47% of them thought that the board was responsible for some significant malalignment and problems. And I share this because if you have a problem with your board or with your director or the person that you report to, or if you believe they don't understand what you're doing, or they're not supportive of it, or their priorities are misplaced, you are not alone. You are not unique and special. You are like everybody in every industry. And your challenge then is to figure out, how do you manage up to your boss? How do you manage up to the person you report to or the people you report to, so that you can help them understand your position, why what you think is important and needs to be done. And this is ultimately, if you're going to move into any sort of leadership role long term in a business, you have to be good at managing up. Otherwise, you find yourself just being a angry soccer coach sitting at a bar bitching about everything. We're sort of moving along that diagram and that checklist of a club. So now we talk about culture. And I think there's a few, I said earlier, culture set by the worst behaviors you tolerate, but I think there's a few checklists to think about, some questions when you talk about this sort of amorphous thing of culture. And things that if you can answer these questions more consistently, you have a stronger, more effective culture. One is, does everybody really know what matters to you in your club? And that starts with, what is the mission you're there for? But it also includes, what is it that is acceptable and not acceptable in the behavior of your coaches and the behavior of the players in your club? Do your coaches use the same terminology? And I always use, and it's very much overplayed to a degree, but the concept, is it front foot or is it back foot or forward foot? And generally, if you go to most people and most clubs and you say those things, within 10 seconds, it'll be clear that there are multiple different opinions of what front foot, back foot, and forward foot mean. And that sounds silly and funny until you think about, one day Matt is coaching and telling a player to receive on their front foot, and he means this. And the next day, somebody else is coaching and they say receive on their front foot, or they say receive on their back foot, but they mean what Matt says when he says front foot. And ultimately, players are spending as much time trying to figure out what you mean as they are about actually the concept of application. And that's an easy example because it's so obvious, but there's so many other words that you are throwing around in training and when you're speaking to staff, that you have this concept of what it means to you that is not necessarily the same as what the listener believes it is. And if you're not clear in terminology, so that when you're using words that are really important, everybody knows what it means and where it applies, then your players are probably not learning as quickly as you would like. So beyond the coaches using the same terminology, when you start to hear players say the same thing as the coaches, and I think we've all sort of had that when a player repeats something that you've said later on or in a game from a training session, that's obviously a good indication of transfer. But when it's happening across team after team, so the coaches are using the same words and phrases, then you start to hear the players using the same words and phrases, that's a pretty good sign that there's some good consistency and alignment across your age groups. When players in your club go to a training session, do they generally know what the rhythm of the session is? And obviously the content can be very different from day to day, but do they understand that when we show up, this is generally what's expected, this is generally how we start, this is what happens in the middle, this is how we finish, and this is how we wrap up. Is that consistent across not only teams from age group to age group, but is it consistent from teams from level to level? And a lot of times when we talk about clubs, everybody always thinks about connecting their 14s to their 15s to their 16s at the top. And they don't think about, well, what about the second team at 14 and the third team at 14? Because if they're not aligned in these things, then you're pretty much just taking money to fund programs as opposed to providing a similar experience at multiple levels that ultimately should be designed to help players bubble up, right? From the second team to the first team and the third team to the second team, whatever it may be. Consistency in the way your teams play, that's pretty obvious. Do players get the same messages with different styles from all of the coaches? So again, the way I say things is going to be very different than some of the coaches that I work with. But generally, the intent of the message, the content of the message is the same. We're not saying solve problems differently or play differently, but the way we say it might be different. If you have different content, then you start to have a problem. Similar to that, when players move from team to team or age group to the age group, do they feel like they've seen the activities before? Or when they go to Tony's sessions, has Tony come up with some completely new, unheretofore discovered training activity that they found in the jungles of Brazil, but he wants to put into play? Because if you're going from coach to coach who's doing totally different activities and totally different things, then again, you're slowing the learning of the players. And then obviously core values communicated consistently and, more importantly, seen in action. And this phrase is a military phrase. Morale is a force multiplier. And I'd say the same thing about culture. When you start to get everybody with the same beliefs about why they're here, the same things that are important to them, the same general ways of doing things, the same consistent environment from age group to age group, you start to see that your training and the learning process will be exponentially smoother and faster. So we talked a little bit, I'll skip through this a little bit, about the career path. This quote here from Forbes is talking, maybe a simpler way of saying it is, you don't hire for aptitude, you hire for attitude, which means hire people that believe in what you believe in, want to be a part of your organization, and if they're excited about it, they're philosophically aligned, they're aligned in values, you can train them and you can develop them, and you're going to have a far more effective and happy environment than if you hire somebody who maybe comes in with more experience and skills, but is not philosophically aligned or aligned from a values perspective. So from a coaching career path and looking at mentoring coaches, the phrase here when you're talking about evaluation of fit is that bad hires make bad fires. And another way of saying that is you want to go through a much longer evaluation process before you get into hiring people. And I know that's hard to do sometimes because coaches are one of the scarce resources in the game. There's just not enough of them. But you're better off taking a longer time to make sure you get the right person and maybe juggling some conflicts in the meantime than you are just getting a person and then constantly recycling and having to change. Then onboarding is about what you're doing to help them not only get used to things, but understand why you do things the way you do, help them to see people that can be formal and informal mentors, be there to help make sure that things aren't falling through the cracks and it's not the sort of way it was, at least, and it still is in some places, but here's your bag of balls and there's your field and I'll see you at the end of the season when we have our Christmas party. But there's more onboarding to what it takes. What do we do then once somebody's working in the club and is comfortable in the club in terms of ongoing support and mentorship so that they become experts at what they do? And I think soccer is an area that is not as far along as other careers and other professions are in terms of really helping people become experts. So it's one thing to have your C license or your B license. It's another thing to be really good at managing a team. It's one thing to have a B license or an A license. It's another thing to be good at helping players learn year over year from age group to age group and understanding sort of long-term methodology. So what are we doing as an organization to help our coaches move from well-meaning and basically qualified people to experts in their area? And then ultimately, what do we do to evolve the profession and create new roles so that as people age and change, that there are roles in the organization that are valued and that are created to keep those people in the sport in more mentorship, management, and leadership roles that are not just, hey, you've been here for 25 years, here's your next U10 team. Now, for somebody who wants to focus in that and wants to work dedicated as a coach on the field with a specific group of ages, that's great. But not everybody's going to be that way. Some people really want to be Academy 10 and under coaches. Some people really want to work with older teams. Some people over time are going to move from that to say, okay, I don't necessarily want to coach a team as much anymore. I want to help coaches. I want to do other things. I want other challenges. So what are we doing in our organizations to evolve them so that we can have that dynamic career path for people as they advance in the game? And then ultimately, what do we do to prepare them for that? So a couple of things to think about. And again, this can be from a director perspective or a coach perspective when you're talking about sort of the flow of a club. And I look at that as players sort of going through the experience throughout a year, and then the players going through a club throughout multiple years, which is what are we doing to ensure consistency in player experience from age group to age group, which is the most common way of thinking about it, but also from level to level. I would make the argument that much of what you do should be the same from a methodology perspective, level to level. Where you are in that might be very different. The activities you use might be very different. But I personally don't think that because your second and third team players may be lower level athletes or lower level skill, that should mean, fuck it, let's knock it up the field and chase it and press because they're not very good. It should be about teaching them to play the same way your first team is so that ultimately the best kids can bubble up, because I think that's an area that we don't have enough of in this game, which is late developers that bubble up when they physically mature. And I think a lot of that is potentially related to the environments that they're in. What do we talk about when we're talking about planning for individual growth? And I think most people are very focused on the top, and I don't think that's a bad thing, because I think it's a lot harder to help a top level player get better than it is to help a lower level player get better, because the margins are thinner. So having specific plan for your elite top talent, whether you call it a talent development plan or whatever acronym goes with it, that's pretty clear that those players maybe need to train more. They maybe need to have some special attention because of the level they have, the aspiration they may have. Then we also tend to have ideas about the lower performing kids, the people that we think aren't going to make the team next year, they're going to move down a level, or the people that are really, really struggling. There should be a plan for those players, not only on trying to help them move up, but if they are going to move down, when I say move up, I mean at least get into the middle of the team. But if they are going to move down a level, whether it's within season or at the end of the season, it should not be a surprise. It should be something that by the time it happens, it's something that they completely understand why, they completely understand what the next steps are. And this is not something where they look at a website one day, see their name, and that it's at a different age group, and they say, what the heck's going on? But I think when you talk about the top and the bottom, then what a lot of us forget about is the middle, and saying just because these are your sort of piano carriers, your core group, they're not necessarily the ones scoring all the goals and getting all the accolades, but they're starters number 6 through 10. What are we doing to help maybe get one of those into the special level? Or do we just kind of take for granted where they are because they tend to be the least squeaky wheels? So we should be looking, I think, more specifically in these tiers about specific plans for these groups of players. And then ultimately, when you talk about overall in a club, ownership of the process and the outcome is really important, because we play a small role for sure in the whole landscape of a kid's development. But when we constantly complain about what players are not, or what our players do not do, and we never take a step back and say, you know what, maybe there's something we are doing or not doing in our environment that is making that more likely to happen, we have to take ownership of the failing of our players or our teams in order to improve it. And even though we may ultimately say there's a lot of factors we don't control that predominantly impact why this didn't work, or why this player failed, or why this team didn't do very well. And I think there's probably a lot more factors that we don't control than we do. But the factors that we do control, we have to take ownership of. Because if we can make an adjustment there, you never know how that might play out in starting to impact factors that you don't have direct control over. So from a leadership perspective and managing this flow, and I love this quote. I don't know who the gentleman is who's at the presentation there, but I love him. Ultimately, we also complain a lot and talk about how people don't listen, or how we've already communicated something. We say this a lot with players. We say this a lot with people that report to us. But ultimately, and I think the general rough approximation is that you need to say something 7 times for people to really take it in, embrace it, and understand it. And I think there is, in all of these things, whether we're talking about communicating player pathways, talking about values and beliefs, talking about game model and philosophy, talking about methodology, there is no such thing as over communicating. If you think you're over communicating, you're probably just barely communicating enough. You need to do things over and over and over and over and over. And if you don't, you can't be surprised that somebody didn't get the memo, that somebody didn't remember the email, that somebody didn't hear you say that. You have to repeat it over and over. And ultimately, failure to do that is failure to communicate. And as I think about this, Doug Limoff had a great blog post talking about interventions and stoppages that I think is relevant to this, which is a coach who makes a stoppage and makes a very good point on whatever it is that needs to be improved and communicates it effectively. The players go back, they keep playing for whatever period, 3-5 minutes, and then the coach makes another stoppage and moves on to another point that he now effectively communicates, the players understand, and then moves on 5 minutes later to another point. And his comment was, if every time you tell the players what they should focus on and what you're looking for them to do, and then they go do it, and then you change the target the next time you stop it, you can't be surprised then when they don't really ultimately acquire that and understand it, because you have demonstrated by your behavior that you communicate one thing, then you go to something else, then you go to something else, you go to something else. There's not enough repetition. There's not enough commitment to staying on topic and on task for them to really stay on topic and on task long enough to fully understand and apply. Communication pathways. There's formal ones, DOC to staff, staff to players, and staff to parents. And the more aligned those communications are, the more consistent they are, the more you will see consistency in the communication pathways that you don't control. Staff to staff, player to parents, parent to player when they're outside of your control, parent to parent on the sideline, parent to parent that can either help you nip problems in the bud, or that can pour gasoline on the fire. Couple of concepts here now, switching a little bit to how players learn. I should stop and ask if there's any comments or questions on anything so far.
Hey, Kristen Zecca here. Could you elaborate a little bit on the language piece and on the terminology piece, a little bit on that, if you can?
Sure. I mean, I think the basics is to identify how you want to, what words you want to use to refer to the topics or techniques or decisions that are most common or most important to you. And so front foot, back foot, forward foot, all represent, in theory, receiving either away from the ball right? Or away from a defender or receiving to face forward. But whatever it is that you feel is important in your playing style and in your game model, there should be almost a glossary of terms that every time a coach uses this word or this phrase, this is what it should mean to the players, so that the coaches are all on the same page. And so the players understand that almost as a cue that then generates a whole bunch of other additional thoughts in their mind related to that cue. So another one I'll use is high pressure defending. So I distinguish between high pressure and aggressive defending. Aggressive defending is I'm getting in your face individually. I'm closing you down and getting touch tight. High pressure defending is a block of players higher up the field, moving together up the field in number. Because when we talk about high pressure defending, I think to a lot of youth players, they think there's high pressure when there's one knucklehead sprinting into their face. And even if they're playing 5v1, they think of that as high pressure. And when we're talking about how you decide to play out or when to play indirectly or directly, one of the major cues is high pressure or overloads in terms of numbers. And so they need to understand when we talk about high pressure, we're saying that there are multiple defenders high on the field that either equal your number in attack or overload your number in attack. And that's very different than somebody who's really tight in your face and may be very aggressive, but you have three supporting players that are wide open around you. And I think if coaches are using those terms differently, then it impacts the player's ability to understand and make decisions. Does that make sense? So moving, and I'm probably taking too long here. So moving to sort of some thoughts on professional youth development. I think there's a lot of coaches in this country that are really good at sort of the performance piece of coaching and not necessarily the formation or the development piece of coaching. And I distinguish on that. The performance coaching is being able to make adjustments in a game, to understand a tactical problem in a game, to be able to move a player, to decide that you need more numbers in midfield, or you need to change the shape of the team, to neutralize an effective opponent, or to find a way to get the ball to a more effective player on your team in a certain space. Those things are skills. I think they're important skills in winning games, but it is a very different skill than understanding how do you get a player to be able to make those decisions themselves. How do you get a midfield group to understand that they're overloaded in the middle of the field because they're playing two central midfielders against three, and they need to bring in an outside midfielder to help pinch in to equalize the numbers, or they have to bring a center back to step up sometimes, or drop a forward in to equal out those numbers. Getting a player who can make that decision and recognize it in the moment themselves is very different than a coach on the sideline who can say so-and-so tuck in. And I think those are very different skills, and I do not think we have a lot of coaches that are effective in that. And the difference here is what makes you an effective coach when winning is the ultimate metric, and when you're coaching at the higher age groups, and when really learning is the metric, which is the majority of the age groups I think that we are working in. So I'm going to take on that note, a little bit of a sidebar here on sort of the one of the newer perspectives of understanding the game, and it's through the lens of ecological dynamics and complexity, which is looking more at the relationships between teammates, opponents, and space than it is on the abilities of players. And they're looking at it from the perspective of understanding systems. And systems, and I'm not the scientist, the ecological scientist here, who is an expert in the science, but this is what characterizes a complex system, which is one, autonomy. There's a large number of people or organisms making independent, simultaneous decisions. Well, that sounds like a soccer game. There's interdependency, which is there's basic rules or connections that guide general behavior. So think about how a team moves together, how a back four moves together. Sounds like a soccer game. There's uncertainty, in the sense that there's unpredictability of what's going to happen next, both from my opponent, but also from my teammate and within the environment. And then there's a dynamic and constant exchange of information and decisions and actions that are going on. Those are the factors that ultimately make up a complex system. And within that, what happens is behavior arises throughout these interactions in the game. So a little bit complicated, but I think it's important. If you understand or look at soccer through this lens, it fundamentally changes how you teach it. So this is a graphic that I made up to sort of make that more clear, which is the blue here is a rough 4-4-2, and the white is a 4-3-3 in my kindergarten art skills here. But if you can imagine this shape kind of moving and adjusting up and down the field as these players and these teams make decisions, as you would see in some of the technology that you get at the highest levels when they're doing video analysis, what's happening in this game is that all 22 of these people are getting information every second about what their teammates are doing, what their opponent is doing, what the ball is doing. You're right, Matt, I did forget the goalkeeper, so I think I just failed my A license, and Raymond would kill me right now. They're getting information all the time, over and over, every second, that is going to it's ultimately going to impact their decisions and their actions. So they're constantly trying to read the situation, make a decision that makes sense based on what they think their teammate's going to do, what they think the opponent's going to do, what they think is likely to come next. Then they make decisions, they perform actions, and then they reflect and assess whether it worked. And then they go back and they're making the next decision. And so this is obviously something that is happening second by second, millions of times in a game. And if you think that what we're trying to do in this sport is teach 11 players to see the same situation at the same time, identify the same problem, and identify a collective solution, that is a really, really, really complicated piece of thinking. And if we look at the game and understand that's what's going on in a player's mind, is I'm looking at this incredibly complicated environment, trying to predict what's going to happen next based on the reactions, actions, and anticipations of teammates and opponents, it really changes how we set up a learning environment. And so a couple things here. One, learning, and we know this in our life, learning is an emergent experience. Like, this is the worst kind of learning, what I'm doing right now, which is I'm sitting here and talking to you. Like, by definition, I'm an ineffective teacher. Learning is something that is most effective when you are engaged in it and you can apply it, and then you can learn from your success and failure from that. There's a phrase, the fastest way of getting an idea from the speaker's mouth to the listener's paper without touching their brain is to lecture. So the fastest way to get it from my mouth to your paper without touching your brain is to lecture. So when we lecture, and I'm not talking about talking and unpacking complicated ideas. I'm not talking about giving players some more substance. I'm talking about thinking that talking about it is going to help them apply and make decisions better in the long term. Learning is something people have to wrestle with. Within that, the primary skill I think that we need to be concerned with as young coaches is perception. And that is, what does the player see? And are they even seeing the right thing or not? And so often we're coaching things based on what we think the problem is. And a lot of times the problem actually goes far earlier than that, which is that the player either doesn't know what to look for, or they're looking for the wrong piece of information, or they're looking in the wrong place for the right piece of information. Because only when they know how to look, where to look, and when to look, can they actually make a decision about what to do with that piece of information. And then ultimately, that's where we get learning, which is the ability to connect information with a decision. And that is perception. What do they see? Now that I've seen the appropriate cues, now how do I decipher between which is the right decision in situation A or situation B? And to go back to that other chart, you're trying to get 11 players to see all of this at the same time and come up with the same solution. So when you're doing that, and you think about verbal feedback, the more that you're talking to them as they're trying to do these things, the more you're taking their attention away from the variables and the information in the environment, and you're putting their attention on the words coming out of your mouth. And that's actually taking away their ability to struggle, succeed, and fail at finding the right information within the environment. And so I think when we look at learning this way, it puts a far more higher emphasis on practice design. And from that perspective, what it means is having a clear behavior or decision that is what you're teaching, what you're trying to get better at. So first you put their attention on the problem, the behavior, the decision that you are focused on today. And then you have to design an activity where that problem or that decision or that action will be repeated over and over and over and over, so they get lots of opportunity to make the decision, make the wrong decision, figure out why it didn't work, figure out why this piece of information was missed, or why the application of this piece of information was incorrect. And that if you can put their attention into the right area and design the right activity, they will be learning without you saying a lot of things. And that's the point of the ice cube, because, and the ice cube, again, is a stolen analogy of, it's like if you take an ice cube that's at 5 degrees and you heat it and you heat it and you heat it, and it goes up to 20 degrees, you say, what the hell's going on? Nothing's happening. My heater must be broken. And then you heat it and you heat it and you heat it, and it gets up to 31 degrees and it's still an ice cube. And you say, well, this is useless, it's not working. And then miraculously at 32 degrees, all of a sudden it starts to melt. And the same thing, if you have put players' attention in the right spot, and then if you design the right activity, there is a lot of learning that's going on in their brain that's not going to be seen immediately as they're struggling with the information and figuring out where to look, when to look, and what to do with that information. And I think we have to be cognizant of that. And ultimately, I think this last, skipped it. If you do that correctly, what you're helping them do is you're really empowering them as learners to have their own error detection and correction process, to be really self-analyzing and self-critical at how they're making decisions and whether they made them appropriately and how to make them better next time. And you're getting them to do that in real time in their own minds, rather than you having to be the coach who's constantly got the answer. So a couple of things in that. One is, in that situation, knowing does not mean the ability to do. And so I use an example here of a back four, and you're talking to a back four about one of the most basic cues in the game, which is when there's no pressure on the ball and there's a runner on the back line, and you see the player with the ball look up and look down, you need to drop off because the ball is probably going to go behind you. And every center back above a certain minimum age generally should know that cue. And yet then you go into a game and you see the exact situation unfold. The center back stands and looks and watches the ball go over their head and turns and chases it. And you say, what the heck? Why is this happening? We just trained this, and yada, yada, yada. And ultimately, the issue there is not the player's knowledge. It's their ability in the moment to actually understand what they're looking at. Because in that moment where there was no pressure on the ball, a runner on the line, and the player on the ball looked up and looked down, the center back wasn't even taking that piece of information in. Their attention was distracted somewhere else, somewhere far less relevant than that critical piece of information. And that's ultimately the difference between I know what to do and I pass the test on paper versus I can do it because in a complex dynamic game, I can see that piece of information and apply it right away. With training design, similar to this, same idea, you need to manage complexity without impoverishing context. What that means is ultimately you can teach any situation in the game in 11v11. It's just not going to happen very frequently. So when you're talking about what is the behavior or the decision or the action that you want to train in this activity, you need to figure out, how do I present this such that that behavior happens a lot, but in a way that is relevant to the game. If I make it irrelevant to the game, or where it doesn't transfer, where the same cues that I'm asking them to solve or find in this activity are not presented in the same way in the game, then it won't transfer. And so even if they get better at the activity, then they go on Saturday and they don't perform better, because ultimately the cues that you got them thinking about in your activity were fabricated. So you need to figure out, how do I design a very game-like situation with cues that are very relevant to the position and location on the field and the type of scenario, but that occur far more often than you do in 11v11, and that's how you get better at a decision. And then within that, like we said, you need to put their attention specifically on the behavior and the action. And then you as a coach need to have your attention specifically on the anticipated errors, where you think it's going to go wrong and why. What are the things you're going to redirect them to, what's important, and how do they apply this? And if your attention is focused and their attention is focused, you're going to get a lot of learning that's going on. And I think oftentimes we make mistakes on both of these. We don't get their attention in the right spot, but then as a coach, we come in and say, this is the situation I want to coach today. And then you get into it and you get frustrated by something else, or something else jumps out to you and you divert your attention to that. And 20 minutes later, you spent most of your session on something that you didn't really want to talk about because you got distracted instead of really focusing on what it is that you want to place their attention on. And then within that, I think it's also important to know, and this is one of the primary principles of tactical periodization, is that information load is actually more important than physiological load when you're thinking about teaching and learning. And, you know, I've made this mistake so many times where I have what I feel is a great session on Monday that we really dove into a decision and a behavior or a situation and really learned and dug deep. And I said, that was a great session. And on Tuesday, we're going to go the next step. And then Tuesday's session is terrible. And I feel like, what's the difference now? And you typically, as Doug Lemoff would say, you blame the learner. And ultimately, the problem isn't the learner in that situation. It's if I do a really, really detailed session on Monday that demands a lot from them thinking, then just like if I did a big physical session one day, I can't do the same thing the next day. The information load the next day has to be significantly lower because their brains are fatigued and they need to recover in the same way that their bodies are from the physical day. Similar to this, the forgetting curve, which some of you have probably read about or talked about. This is the ultimate answer to why when you do a session on Monday and you think you've solved the problem, on Saturday, it looks like Monday's session never happened. And that fundamentally is because when you're teaching something new or something novel, typically you will forget up to 40 to 50% of it within a few days because the brain just moves on. So the learning curve emphasizes the importance of long-term methodology, which is if you really want a player to get something into long-term memory, which is what the definition of learning is, you have to plan on how you repeat and layer in over time. Because touching on a topic once is a guarantee that they will forget the majority of it within a very short period of time, and they'll forget almost all of it within a medium period of time. But each time that you go back and you touch on that topic, the rate of forgetting decreases because it starts to stick into their head in long-term memory. This here is a design when we talk about, it's just a very, again, simple concept. There's nothing scientific here, but just a thought of when you're thinking about how do I make a training session that looks like the game, but has more of the repetition of the behavior that I want. These are the areas that you can manipulate as a coach. You can change attack to defense ratios. You can change position orientation, location on the field, total numbers, spaces. And these are the variables that you manipulate in order to get high repetition of the behavior, but without taking out the cues that the player ultimately has to learn in order to apply it on a game day. And so here, and it's completely made up, but if the dark blue is what the game looks like and the light blue is what your session looks like, it doesn't mean they have to be the same, because you may change number of players or number of attackers in order to get more repetitions of something, but you need to know why you're doing that. There needs to be a deliberate manipulation of variables because that's going to help the repetition increase without taking away the cues that are relevant to the game. Last couple slides, and I'll go really quickly through here. A game model, which I think you guys are pretty much familiar with. This is the basics of that. There's levels of principles that basically go into more and more detail, and what it takes to execute a higher level principle is basically what's in the lower level principles. This is about defining the way that you want to play. It starts with a vision of the game. You set out principles, which are the behaviors and actions that define what you're trying to do in the different moments of the game, and then you break those down. Implementation of a game model within a club looks generally like this, which is one, develop a game model with all of the principles that are important to you, that describe how your teams would play in an ideal game in attack, defense, and transitions. Then you design a learning plan for each of those principles. So how are you going to teach this principle from its most basic level all the way to 11 aside? So that's what the sort of example, going 4v1 to 4v2 to 5v2 to 6v3 to 8v4. Those are, very simple, obviously. But as you're increasing complexity, it gets more and more demanding on the player, and it looks more and more directly like the game. But each principle should be able to be trained in a more and more simplified way. Then you determine how you implement it, and how you introduce trainings, and which principles do you train when and why, how you layer that in over a session, over a week and a month. Here's a template of a game model. Go back here. I think I'll go back here. Here's a template. So your game model, you see the 4 moments of the game, and then set pieces. You see team, group, and individual principles in each phase. This is the one that we use here at our club. And I will say, I've seen a lot of different game models. I've never seen any one of them look like another one. I don't think there's a right answer to a game model, but it is a logical structure of your thinking. So we have a primary principle of how we want to play in the attacking moment, and a counter principle to play directly when forced to. And then in order to progressively and quickly build the attack, these are our team principles: create and use a big shape, efficiently break lines, circulate down balance. You can read it all. And then below that are sub principles that refer to individuals or groups within the team. So the way we look at this is, once we have a game model with your core principles, and to be honest, we've tried to eliminate and shrink this more and more and more because it gets cumbersome and effective. But to say, okay, if these are the things, if these are the behaviors from an individual to a group to a team level that we need to teach in order to play the way we want to in our club, then what we can do is say, if that principle is how it's expressed at the highest level, how do we bring it down all the way through the lowest level? So how do we reduce numbers and spaces to make it simpler, both in terms of overall numbers and other variables? And how do we make it more complex when we want to build it up? And then for us, this is what we look like. So these are 2 principles in attack here. So you can see the team principle, create and use a big shape. These are sub principles: occupying channels, position between lines, create depth and length. And then across this, you can see from U8 to U12, and we look like, okay, what piece of that are we going to teach at what age group? What is appropriate for an 8-year-old or a 9-year-old or a 10-year-old to be able to understand within this specific model about how we want to play? And when you think that at 8, 9, and 10, you're training twice a week, maybe 3 times a week if you're more ambitious, and you've got all of these attacking things to do, all of these defending things to do. You think about create width, how complicated is that? And you think, well, as a U8, maybe there's going to be 2 or 3 sessions in a season that are focused on that concept. So this is how we look to build out our learning lines within the club, so that we say if a kid comes in at age 8, by the time they're U13, and I'm cut off a few columns, in theory, and this is all in theory, they really understand what it takes to do all these things. And then from that age group on, it's really about perfecting it, and it's about being able to do it in a variety of different contexts of the opposition and other things. So last slide here, sort of a recap. Creating a career path for yourself and for the people in your club, educating yourself as a professional and being an expert in what you do. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. And I know there's a lot of information here, and I've gone a little bit probably over the time limit. And I know it's really, really difficult. Like I said at the beginning, these are my opinions. They'll probably change over the next year. I hope they will, because ultimately, as I hope I'm learning and getting better, I look back at what we did 3-5 years ago and sort of shake my head. And I think that's usually a good sign, unless we're just really, really far behind. And then it's just a sign of how knuckleheaded-ish we can be. But it is challenging. But I think when you go back, that first question, what makes you a professional and what makes your organization a professional? I think this is one of the things that you have to be thinking about. It's doing the things that are difficult. So that's it for me, Matt.
You were on fire, dude. You could have kept going. I know you had another 25, 30 minutes in you. All right. So since we don't have a massive audience here, is there anybody that obviously we've got mostly our staff and a handful of other people who we've invited in. Anybody have any questions? I don't want to keep Christian for too long because it's 9:45 over there. So he's got to get some beauty sleep. But want to get him, if you have any questions, let's throw them out there whilst we have his time. Bueller.
Hopefully I didn't put everybody to sleep.
Matt, I have a question for Christian.
Yep, what do you got?
Christian, this is Derek Evans. One of the things that you brought up, I'd like you to articulate, with our coaching staff, we've got a nice group of coaches, from young coaches to older coaches that have gone on. And it probably goes to the point in terms of why do we coach and how do you coach, what style of coaches. So if the message in terms of from a DOC standpoint or from a coaching perspective, because, coaches obviously are comprised of different types of intensity, coaches that are verbal, coaches that essentially take more of a teaching aspect and so on and so forth. How important is it? Because, with the older coaches, you tend to maybe it's a little bit more difficult for them to change in their coaching style and their coaching ways and so on. The objective, I guess, what I'm saying is in terms of looking at your coaching staff, understanding what they do well, what they need to get better at from an educational standpoint. And after all, I think we're all educators to a certain degree. So as you comprise your coaching staff and you see what coaches are made of, what their strengths are, what their inadequacies or what their weaknesses are, what are some of the recommendations you would give from a DOC standpoint or from a coaching perspective in terms of getting those coaches, young, older coaches, to the same level where we're all pretty much on the same, where we're sending the same message, using the same verbiage, that sort of thing?
Well, I think it's a good question, but so I think one of the things to keep in mind is I go back to that Mark Twain quote at the beginning of, it's not the things that you don't know, it's what you know that isn't so that gets you in trouble. And I think we have to keep that perspective in mind, that no matter how long we've been coaching, we have to critically reassess what we're doing and whether it's the right thing and whether it's working. I mean, in some ways, it's crazy, right? Even in the environment we're in right now, and today was some really good news with respect to COVID-19. But 2 weeks ago, models were saying 2.2 million people are going to die, and then a week ago it was 100 to 200,000. Today it's 81,000 to 45,000 or something like that. I mean, the model's changing, the data's changing, and they're reassessing. And I'm not making any comment about who's smart or not, but they're reassessing. And I think we as coaches, as we get older, we have to constantly be willing to reassess, is there a better way to do what we're doing? Or is what we're doing really the best way? I personally, I think there's a lot of people that struggle to do that. So I think when it's easier to hire younger coaches who don't have fixated positions of, this is how I do it and this is what I believe. And I think there's a lot of people who, after a couple of years of doing something, think they're experts at it, and then learning shrinks. So I think part of it is, one, cultivating that sort of constant self-criticism. I think one of the phrases is you should have strong opinions that are weakly held. So strong opinions weakly held means believe in what you do, but be willing to change it when it's proven not to work. And if we don't have people who are like that, and you know as a leader or as a director that they are not what you want, or they are not doing what you want, but they are not willing to change, then I think you need to move them on. And for people that are willing to change, then that's fundamentally our role, that all of us, myself included, we don't do enough of helping young people understand better what we want. Because I don't think most people fail because they're being deliberately obtuse. I think they fail because they don't understand what you want, or they think you want something different. So it's really important to be really clear and repeat over and over what it is that you want and why you want it. And actually, the more collaborative that process is, or the more collaborative the process is in developing what you want, the more likelihood there is that the people are going to buy into it. But I think it's a combination of both.